I just finished a great conversation with Doug King, who is with an organization called Presence. I found Doug King through his Presence podcast several years ago and eagerly listened to many episodes of where he talks about his integral theology. And Doug is based in Georgia and does a lot of work in this area, bringing together spiral dynamics and the biblical narrative, and is also part of the evolutionary leaders group, where he's working with scientists and all kinds of people to be looking at a unitive narrative. And they talk about things like the holo movement and part of Ken Wilber's work and group. So Doug has quite an interesting background and does really wonderful work. So I'm so excited to share this conversation with you today that I had with Doug King. So welcome to the Sacred Everywhere. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Sacred Everywhere. I'm Dr. Sheri Kling, and in this space we explore how the sacred shows up in real life, in our questions, our struggles, our longing, and our hope. Can we find the sacred in every place and everyone? Let's see. All right, well, welcome, Doug King, to the Sacred Everywhere. So glad to have you with me today.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you, Sheri. I always love these discussions with you. Very thought provoking.
Well, thank you. And the same here. Just will say briefly here that I discovered your Presence podcast a few years back and quickly consumed all the seasons that you had available at the time. And just, where you talk about spiral dynamics and the biblical narrative and your integral theology, the way you approach putting those two together. And I just love it. I've just gotten so much out of it and so respect your background and your knowledge that you have in the biblical narrative. And what you've done, I think, is so important and so um, uh, life changing in the way we are looking at this text. So that's why I wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about how we approach not just the biblical narrative, but maybe a little bit about how we approach any sacred text. But I certainly want to start there with how you bring these things together and kind of so why don't you just tell us first a little bit about kind of your approach to the biblical narrative and what you're trying to do with your work in that area.
Yes, I appreciate that very much. And I will say, um, likewise, I have been reading your material and following all the work you've done in process and with Jungian perspectives and so forth as well, and gained a lot of really great insights as well. So, uh, tit for tat on this. Um, yeah.
We learn from
So
each other.
exactly. Um, so my background is that I did start in what most people would consider to be a very fundamental worldview when it came to interpreting the biblical narrative. I grew up in a very conservative background, and I have always had a great respect for the biblical narrative. I gained, in that sense, a lot from my fundamentalist background in terms of an appreciation for the content of the narrative. We were very big on studying all the content of the law, the prophets, Psalms, apostolic writings, gospels, etc. And so we were big on that. But over the years, like many, and I'm sure in your audience as well, Sheri, a lot of evolution took place in my life in terms of what I was seeing in the narrative. And the narrative itself has always remained the same for me. But like so many of us, the more we study it, look at it, contemplate, the deeper sometimes we see meanings, and the more we see a bigger story. And I think that's the crux of it for me. I saw a much bigger story, and it wasn't because I just wanted it to be a big story. Because I think most of us, and certainly you and your audience, we all have a heart for wanting unity. We want
Right.
unity across the planet. We want peace on earth. We want interrelationship. We want the ability to not just coexist, but to really appreciate the divergence of the human family and to
Hmm.
really be able to look at it as a human family, relational. And so it was more, of course, I had that, but as I studied the narrative, Sheri, I started from the beginning, the genesis of the story, and I began to look at it as simply a story about God relationship and the degree to which and the manner in which human beings relate to God, with God. And I came out to a place, skipping to the place where I am now. I came out to a place where I now see the biblical narrative as one seamless story. Now, that's a radical statement from the standpoint that for the last 2 millennia, we would really say that the biblical narrative is a story whose outcome is two world religions.
Right.
Okay. Now, what I have seen, and I started there, but what I see now as I've studied forward, right or wrong, but what I understand now is that it's actually no, it's one seamless story about the evolution of spiritual consciousness regarding what I call universal God identity.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there are a couple of things. Number one, when I was in the more fundamentalist mindset, the term universal or universalist was anathema. It was heretic. Never mind. I've heard enough. End of story. And that's where I was at that time. However, as life progresses and you begin to see the nature of nature, I'm really big on science, love science, and in the work that I'm doing now and the writing I'm doing now, I will have some things to say regarding science. Except it won't just be me. I will be talking with people that are in quantum physics and people that are in evolutionary biology. So it's not just me as a non-scientist making some proclamation, but having discussions about the fact that this whole universe is not built on building blocks that we can separate and parse out. The whole thing is interconnected, interrelational, holistic, as in WHOL, holistic.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that comes from some kind of source. And for
Yeah.
those of us of faith, it's a source that we would say is transcendent.
Hmm.
In the biblical narrative, this source is called God. In other narratives, it's called by other names. But essentially, for me, when I'm talking with folks, whatever their narrative is, I find most people are comfortable with at least using the word source if God has baggage or other terms are not appropriate for
Yeah.
that.
Hmm.
So, in the beginning of the story, Sheri, you have Father Abraham, and the very term father is a relational term. I mean, now from the very beginning of the story, this idea of family is brought in, this idea of tribal is brought in because you go from Abraham down to his grandson, Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, and then his 12 sons become what? 12 tribes. And the
Hmm.
story then progresses from there, but it's anchored in this ethnocentric understanding of relationship, ethnocentric.
Right.
Well, the ethnocentric is kind of like an instinctual thing. For you and me, Sheri, when we're talking about our family members, we're talking about moms and dads, or we're talking about siblings or whatever, that comes naturally. That's an instinctive thing. It's found throughout the animal kingdom. Everybody knows about the mama bear, the she bear, and her cubs, and so forth. But the story is to say, yeah, it starts there. And there is this ethnocentric promise in the very beginning to Abraham. And that promise is, I will make of you a great nation, singular. And that
Hmm.
related to the ethnocentric 12 tribes as they begin to uncover and understand what is our relationship with God.
Yeah.
That relationship goes from an ethnocentric understanding of God where it was them against all the surrounding countries, those that had other gods, etc., all the way to part two of the promise. And part two of the promise is, through you, Father Abraham, I will bless all nations of the earth. That to me is a world centric fulfillment of a story that begins with an ethnocentric beginning.
Right, right. And so many miss that. So many miss that huge thing. And just like, I know you talk a lot about this, and so does Richard Rohr. And I'm going to jump ahead for a second, but
Yeah,
to the Gospels and then to Paul, where Paul says God will be all in all.
yeah.
And I think you say not all in some.
Right, exactly. And and then of course we'll get into, and this is down the road stuff, but eventually you're going to get into how is that possible?
Mhm.
Because there has to be some way that you can say that that could actually be the case. And there's been a lot of things. I was taught a lot of things that created grooves in my head. And that's just the way I saw it. And it was difficult for me to think outside of the box, if you will, of doctrinal beliefs that were given to me. I thought that my main role in life was to defend those things, was to defend the truth, not grow in it. Later, I realized truth was something in which I grow. And the
Mm.
problem is when from the very beginning you try to grasp the knowledge of good and evil, so that you can be on the same level as God, which then makes it easy for me to judge you and everybody else as to
Right.
whether or not you're okay. So when you look at this seamless story, what then really became for me the biggie of where we are today is how we have for 2,000 years interpreted Christology.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about the way we interpret things, how in the world do we have one story and we've got thousands of denominations where everyone's going to a different building? And in some cases, it's not that big a deal. I might visit with my friend if we're on some kind of denominational level where we kind of get along. But then there's other things where, like, you're an evangelical, I'm a post evangelical. Oh,
Hmm.
you're a Calvinist, I'm an Arminian, I'm a free choice guy. You're predestination. Yeah, there's others that it's like, nope, no, can't even tolerate those views. And of course, we see on the internet all of the discussions that go back and forth today, especially between evangelical and post evangelical. Well, where did those come from? Those come
Hmm.
from worldviews. And you mentioned the model of spiral dynamics, and this is why I use it. It's not a religious model at all. It's simply a worldview model that has traced the history of worldviews
Hmm.
through time, and how they affect the way that we humans make meaning out of what we see, so that we could actually see the same thing, but come up with two different meanings. And it all depends on worldview. Now, the example I like to give is the English poet Alexander Pope. He said, all seems infected, that the infected spy, as all seems yellow to the jaundiced eye. And what he
Right.
was saying was the lens through which you look will determine the meaning you make of what you
Right.
see. And
Right.
so
Right.
in this case, spiral dynamics, and it really focuses with Christology on the three worldviews that have been prevalent in the West since for the last two millennia. That is the traditional, modern, and postmodern. And I think most
Hmm.
people are familiar with those kinds of terms. If you're going to get furniture for your house, the question is, do you want traditional or do you want modern? Okay,
Yeah.
well, where did that come from? It came from worldviews that actually produce something visible based on a thought process. Architecture
Hmm.
is the same, and so forth. So, in spiral dynamics, they will put a color to each of those three views so that it can represent a lens through which you look. So the traditional viewpoint would be blue, modernity would be orange, and postmodernity would be green. So what
Mm,
happens is if I'm a Bible reader and I'm reading through the traditional way, the more fundamental way, I'm reading through a blue lens and I go, what's wrong with you, Sheri? Can you not see that everything here is blue as it can be? It's blue. All right.
right.
Now I read it and I'm reading it through a green lens and I'm looking at them and I'm going, what's wrong with you? My goodness, you're such a fundamentalist. Can you not see that the Bible is clearly green? And so
Right.
and so we get into these worldview conflicts, all of which end up in the field of interpretation. Us theologians, we call it hermeneutics. Uh,
Hmm.
and that's how we really arrived where we are today. You have a lot of blue fundamentalism. You have a lot of green post-evangelical viewpoint.
Hmm.
In the middle is modernity. Modernity is a deconstruction worldview. Hashtag
Yes.
deconstructing faith. Hashtag deconstructing the church. And what is it deconstructing? It's deconstructing the blue that we grew up in, and that we say, oh man, that doesn't fly anymore. That just doesn't make sense. So that's a very general, just a big picture overview of how we got to where we are today in terms of making meaning of this biblical narrative story and why there's so much disagreement.
Yeah. Say, talk a little bit about so the way that you see the situation in the biblical narrative around sin and death, and around the whole the difference between identity coming through form and identity coming through the formless,
Yes, yes, and that's a
and why that's part of the whole thing. Like when we think about whether it's, and I'm not an expert in Rene Girard, but when we think about scapegoating, and all of those
sure.
reasons for separation. And I've talked with you before that I will often talk about, for me, the word sin, which certainly has a lot of baggage, and the term original sin, which a lot of people just chafe when they hear those terms. I like to think about sin as the illusion of separation, that
Yes,
we are in a condition where we are under this illusion of separation. Sinful
yes,
action is action we take under this illusion that hurts others. And then
yes,
original sin is what I would call the necessary illusion of separation, meaning that is how we have a world. That is how we have a world with boundaries between things and forms and diverse individuals and multiplicity, is because we have to think of ourselves as separate from other things, but
yes,
that at the level beyond this time space, whatever we might call it, everything is unity and it is illusory. And whether we talk about that as, oh, we live in a simulation, which is like a lot of, people are using that term these days, or we're living in dream or Maya, which is like play or illusion in the Hindu world. So this all comes from, though, this idea about separation and sin and who's in and who's out. So talk a little bit about where that the problem of that, maybe sort of why we got stuck in that, and what is happening in Jesus and Paul that completely dismantles that.
yeah, because you put your finger right on the crux of the story that goes along with this movement from world centric or from ethnocentric to world centric. When you're in an ethnocentric environment, it's pretty easy to tell who's in, who's out. It's DNA. Check your
Who's got
ancestry.
your blood?
Yeah, just check. I mean, that's pretty easy. Yeah, you're my relative or you're not. You're brother, sister, or you're not. Uh, but that group identity then is what really gets challenged as the story moves along. When we get into the work of Jesus and later the apostles, they're moving from that ethnocentric to including those Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're everybody that's not part of our tribal ancestry or Israel ethnocentric background. And it's not because the people in Israel were bad people. It's not because the people in Israel should have known better. One of the things that I've learned from a lot of these models is that we are all products of some type of growing up or maturing or evolutionary uh, process through time, and that's true of all those who lived back in Abraham, Moses, etc. They did the best they could with where they were in history at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and the worldviews that were present, and the best way you could make meaning out of God. We do the same today. We still come out at different places, but the point is that even though I'm saying it's one seamless story, and even though I'm going to get into your question about form and transform and so forth, and even though I go beyond traditional religion per se, it is in no way a denigration of where people are in their particular place, their particular journey,
Mm-hmm.
their faith. I do not challenge anyone's place of where they are because I've been at various places in my journey, and I do not think that when I was 20 years old, even though I thought completely different than I do now, that I was any less a part of the universal God identity than I am today. What has changed is my understanding of
Yeah.
God identity. That's what changed. But I but God identity itself has always been that which is one, and not separated. So when you use the word separation, first of all, that in the biblical narrative is death. That's a definition for death.
Right.
Prodigal son. This my son was dead. Now he's alive. It's a separation issue.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I talk with people who are interested. If this bothers you or gets people upset, I'm not here to have that conversation. But
Yeah.
for people that are concerned about the process of denomination as an identity, to say my I am statement is I am, and then you fill it in with a denomination. If that's where you are and that's where you find your meaning and your faith is best worked out there, then that's where you should be and that's where you should stay. Because I'm not making where you are as a human the determining factor of what God has revealed to be the nature of universal identity.
Mm-hmm.
I am saying that's your step on the ladder or so forth. So in the narrative, the wages of sin is death, and the strength of sin is the law. And this is where we get into boundaries. What is the appropriate use of boundaries? Because boundaries are necessary. We have to have boundaries. You can't
Right.
raise children without having boundaries. You can't have a society without having boundaries. You have
Right.
to have law. If you don't have laws, then you have chaos, and we've regressed back into the warrior era of Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun and all that. So,
Yeah.
what you have is the beginning of ethnocentricity, and it's accompanied by Moses and the law. And so, what is the law doing? It's delineating what you should do. Thou shalt do this. Thou shalt not do that. It's helping you begin the delineation, as you referred to, of things that you're beginning to understand: morals, ethics, decisions about what is good for the human being, what's good for relationships, what's destructive for a human or for relationships. Now,
Mm-hmm. And what's destructive or not to the whole fabric of the community, because that's a key
absolutely.
part of this whole tribal perspective is what keeps the community in. I mean, it wasn't about the individual, that whole focus that we have now on the individual didn't even arise until like the Enlightenment period, pretty much, that it was you were part of a community, of a tribe, of a village, whatever it was, and
Yeah.
your individual needs and wants were always subsumed to that greater set. So the
Great.
laws were,
Yeah.
again, protecting the integrity of that fabric of that community.
Yes. Absolutely. So when you relate that to God identity, now we are getting into determining obedient, disobedient, faithful, unfaithful, accepted, rejected. Now we're starting to determine, is there separation that should come here, and who is it that should determine who's in and who's out? That's the biggie, of course. Um, but what happens with Jesus and then the apostolic writings is that you have a movement, a transformation movement. So my understanding of the biblical narrative is that it moves from form. Form is where you have boundary driven thinking that defines whether you are appropriately within God identity or outside of that God identity. And so it's very important. Is it lawful? This was a question that Jesus faced when he came on the scene, even when he healed someone, something fantastic. What was the question? Is it lawful to do that on the Sabbath? So
Right.
this focus was law. Law. What does law do? It sets boundaries. Why do we need those boundaries? To see if you're on the right side of the boundary with God or not, whether you're inside God's acceptance or not inside that acceptance. And so Paul, when for example he looked back, he said, my revelation, one of, he had many, and we can talk about Paul at some point down the road. He had made one of his revelations was he realized that he had grown up attempting to have a righteousness of his own. That's what he wrote to the Philippians. I realized that. I didn't realize it when I was doing it. And it wasn't because there was anything wrong with the law. Paul said the law is good, but the problem is the human. And if the human is required or put in subjection to a system, a covenant, an agreement, whereby it's up to the human to appropriately keep the law in order to then say, I am like God. I can be like God through my ability to control good and evil in my life. That, Paul said, I realized was a problem with the revelation that came through Christ. So, what is Christ doing? Christ moves into the field of transform, and transformation, Christological transformation, happens in both the individual, Jesus Christ, who's the individual foundation of Christology, the Christological individual, and then there's the Christological collective, which is called the body. So you start with the individual and you move to the body. But that body and that individual, in my reading of the scripture, the text, the story, is a role and function of transform that results not in itself, but it's pointing to and resulting in something beyond form, which is that which is formless. And what does formless do? It takes down all the walls that attempt to put separating things into the nature of God and God identity, that attempt to bring separation into the nature of God, which even in terms of Christology, Paul will say, even Christ cannot be divided. And I see you going down a road where you're trying to divide Christ because you're trying to make Christology another form. And this is my radical, very controversial among many, although I am working with groups today that are also seeking yet the next iteration of Christology. Then is there more to Christology? Have we reached the end? Is this all there is? Can it not be any better? Well, there are those of us that think Christology can be more yet than it has been, not to the denigration of what it is now or what it has been, but just for those of us that are looking, and that is that it's going into the realm of the universal. And formlessness is where the law is not destroyed, because Jesus makes that clear. That's not the way this works. It's fulfilled, meaning it's brought into its true role and function. What is that role and function? Rather than being a form of doctrines and rules that determine whether or not you have God identity, it becomes a guide. It becomes a guide that helps you see in your life whether you're aligned or
Mhm.
not aligned with the God identity you already are innately.
Yeah.
That's a huge change, because now, rather than trying to decide what particular denominational identity I should be, I personally now take more of a view like Paul when he uses terms like children of God, new creation, new heaven
Mhm.
and earth language, new Jerusalem language. I see the transformative work of Christology as the movement from a form based, doing, law based, boundary driven God identity into a universal God identity where law and boundaries are our best efforts to appropriately align with God in all of our different life conditions across this planet. And
Mhm.
so, in that sense, again, transform is not an identity, it's the movement from one identity to another identity. So,
Yeah.
for me, what again becomes very controversial is that I think that Christology was not intended to be a new form, meaning a new religion.
Right.
So the
Right.
work that I do is would be called trans-religious theology, and
Hmm.
now what that does is it really puts the emphasis, Sheri, on um, the source, on God as source. And what I mean by that is that if I hear someone talking about a dream, you know so much about this, that changed them. I'm
Hmm.
not in an argument about the legitimacy of their dream or the story that comes from it. All I want to know is what is the nature of that to which your dream points. If you
Hmm.
have a death experience, if you're an indigenous person that has tribal storytellers, I'm not getting in an argument with you about my Jesus story versus your indigenous story. What I want to know is what is the nature of that to which your story points. So that has taken me into what I would call a trans narrative approach to God, where
Hmm.
I I come from the biblical narrative. I love the biblical narrative. I think there's so much deeper, richer content for us yet to explore and see, like some of the things I'm proposing here. But at the same time, Christians have been attempting to convert the world to the biblical narrative for 2,000 years. And the best that they've been able to do to this point is maybe, a quarter of the population, maybe 25% of the world might claim Christian. But,
Hmm.
but the majority of the world does not. And so
Hmm.
this then brings us back to boundaries. What does that mean then? Or what are we saying about God identity and so forth? So I don't discard Christology. I reinterpret it. I keep it. It means a lot to me. The first century work of the church means a lot to me. But what I'm saying is that that was a generational work, a transformative movement that brought about a new cosmology. And that cosmology is called a new heaven and earth. And it
Hmm.
operates on a whole different uh, principle, and that is where God is source, not the human.
Yeah.
Well, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot to swallow, isn't it?
It is. It is. Now, I definitely, in part two of this conversation, want to get back into more about that new heaven, new earth and what that all means. But before we go there, before we end this first part, talk a little bit about what this means to somebody who is not Christian, who is what we might call post secular, looking for the sacred, looking for meaning, looking for purpose. How does this narrative point to something bigger that is good news for them?
Absolutely. And this is the thing that excites me now about the biblical narrative is that when I look at it, these are all my opinions. When I look at it now, I can take this narrative and I can take Christology anywhere to anyone, including post-secular.
Hmm.
I can take it to an agnostic or even an atheist, and do, but not from a conversion standpoint. Post-secular, for example, um, what are they really trying to define for themselves? One of the key words that I've found that's a connector word when you want to have a conversation with your narrative and their narrative, a connector
Hmm.
word is values. What are
Hmm.
the values that you are seeing in life? What are you as a post-secular person, if you're in a relationship, what values would you say are necessary for that relationship to really be fully enriched and so forth? Then the second thing I do in that conversation is to point out that the biblical narrative talks at great lengths about values from beginning to end. When you get, for example, to Paul, he talks about the fruits of the Spirit.
Hmm.
I say, what if we change that to the values of the Spirit? What if
Hmm.
these are values that you have in your life? What about empathy and compassion and self control and self sacrifice and some of these other things? What if we say those are great values? Wouldn't it be in a great friendship or a great way? And so now, if I'm in the post secular conversation, my question is, what would be the values that are most important to you in your viewpoint? I'm not going to try to again convert you to the fact that I myself believe in a source which the biblical narrative calls God, and I want to
Hmm.
leave this conversation trying to get you into confessing that same God. But what I would like to do is to say to you, take a different approach. And I would like to say to you, you're way more spiritual than you think you are.
Yeah.
So I kind of try to flip the conversation. I actually have done this with people that are atheists, and
Huh.
I've had primarily scientists, and I say, "Well, I think you're very spiritual." And it's a funny conversation when it's kind of like, "Well, no, I'm not." It's like that's an argument I think we could all live with. I think you're
Yeah.
spiritual. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. That's one. But it gets back to values, Sheri, for me, and
Hmm.
that's a place where we can all connect. Is what are the values that we find, and they will relate to morality, to ethics, to the way we have community with each other, to the way we conduct ourselves in uh, nations, world uh, behavior, et cetera, is all going to be based on the values that we
Hmm.
find most important.
And I think it just, especially now, I think about if we all awakened to this reality that God identity is universal, is in every single human being, and even really in every single thing, in
Yes, yes,
everything that exists is grounded in the same source. If
yes,
we saw that with open eyes, it would have to change how we lived. We couldn't be bombing schoolgirls in Iran if we
no,
saw them as
no,
having the same God identity that we
right,
have.
right. And this is how these things permeate, if you will. Uh, it starts with if I look at you as family, I that changes. That just changes because now what happens is if I'm on a different page, even in a Christian argument, evangelical, post evangelical, whatever, now I'm talking about people who are other. Once I can categorize someone as other, I can objectify them. I can say, denigrate them. I can write them off. I can pronounce them as evil. And so what you have is finger pointing where, guess what? You're evil. No, you're evil. No, you're evil. There is no attempt to follow the nature of nature, which again, when we get to the end of the story, the two words that describe source that I love the most are the words reconciliation and restoration. And that is the nature of the source of this universe. God was in Christ reconciling the world. That's a world-centric statement. And
Yeah.
Peter's statement that they were waiting for the restoration of all things. Again,
Mm.
not some things, but the restoration of all things. The nature of the universe is that it reconciles and it restores. I'm a human. I have weaknesses. I will go to my grave with so much I don't really understand. And so, why should I turn around and think that I should start judging other people who, quote, don't get it, rather than trying to pursue a way that I can, through a more family oriented type look at that person, kind of Jesus's love your enemy type approach, find some way to build bridges where I can recognize namaste, the God in you, recognize the God in me, and we can move to that level that you're really putting your finger on.
Yeah. Great. Well, before let's end this part one. What I'd love to start in part two with is to talk a little bit about how we can understand the way of Jesus, not as an exclusionary, boundary driven, believe this and only these people are saved, to another way that we can look at that. And so I want to start there in part two and then move into a little bit more about some of this new heaven, new earth stuff. So let's just end part one here. And if you thank you for listening so far. If you're interested in hearing part two, go to Substack where you can find the full episode there. Thanks for listening to the first half of this episode. If you'd like to go deeper, click on the link in the show notes to access the full episode for paid subscribers of The Sacred Everywhere on Substack. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this episode far and wide. I'd love your help to grow this channel. Until next time, may you notice the sacred everywhere.